Today on the Relationship Revival Show, I am excited to have a guest that I have the honor of calling my friend for well over 10 years, Dr. Phil Wolfson. Dr. Wolfson began practicing psychotherapy in 1966, psychiatry in 1972. He's taught at 3 different graduate schools in psychology and was formerly assistant clinical professor of psychiatry at UC San Francisco. He practiced MDMA, ecstasy psychotherapy, during its legal period and published writings on its use in psychotherapy. He's a founding member of Hefter Research Institute. He's a principal investigator over at MAPS, sponsored MDMA and life-threatening illness study. He's a writer, has numerous articles on psychedelics, spirituality, Buddhism, progressive politics, violence. He's the founder of the Ketamine Training Center that trains and promotes the use of ketamine and other psychedelics by practitioners all across the world, and teaches, in fact, how to administer it in a very structured and well-respected way amongst his peers. And he also started and founded the nonprofit Ketamine Research Foundation. And more than that, he's one of the smartest and most generous and giving people I've ever had the pleasure of knowing. And I know I'm going to be in for a real education and a real treat here, as you are. He's just one of my favorite people in the world, Dr. Phil Wolfson. You're listening to the Relationship Revival Podcast with John DeBach, also known as Mr. Spirituality. That's me. I'm your host, giving you insights and guidance from over 10 years in the field of this amazing journey we call romance. On this show, I go over everything you need to know about how to get into a relationship, how to get the most out of a relationship, and sometimes even how to gracefully end a relationship without pulling your hair out and going crazy. And occasionally, I'm even joined by new and old friends who are also relationship experts to bring you guidance and wisdom with new perspectives. Thanks for stopping by. Phil Wolfson, Dr. Phil Wolfson, thank you so much for being here. We've been friends for, I think it's been about 12 years now.
12 years?
Something like that. Yeah, well, I know. Time flies.
If it be 15, I'd be even happier.
And, you know, I've been grateful to be a small part of your work in the ketamine space and the psychedelic space. And,
I would just break in and say you've been an essential part. We wouldn't be here without you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. For people who don't know, I've helped Phil just with some of the marketing and digital tech to kind of get the programs up and running to train practitioners of ketamine psychedelic psychotherapy. And I believe in
websites. You built our websites for Ketamine Research Foundation, for our nonprofit, for our international organization. You've been a mainstay.
Thank you. Sure. Thank you. For me, I've been really diving deep. I don't know if I ever told you, I went down the path where I almost became an Orthodox rabbi. I mean, you knew me when I was a little more religious. And so I've always kind of done this couples counseling quietly in the background. And I've taken it on much more fervently lately. And, there was a guest on my show out of New York that mentioned that she's studying MDMA as a form of couples therapy. Obviously, it's not available anymore, so it's just theoretical to her. And I thought, well, why not go to the source? I know that you had some experience doing it back when it was permissible. Can you walk me through the history of when that was and what that looked like?
Well, I mean, in truth, it's still going on. It's in the underground. MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, has been pursuing really since 1999, but since MDMA became illegal by bogus scheduling by DEA in 1986, MDMA has been at the forefront of news around it being the first psychedelic other than ketamine and marijuana, really, because we shouldn't put those aside to have the potential for being prescribable by physicians and practitioners under a very strict regimen that FDA is yet to release the results of. That's a whole complex story about MDMA and illegality and the rest. So let me honor your request and step back a moment.
Sure.
MDMA was first made in Germany, and it was cast aside. It was alongside in 1912 or 14, depending who you go to, a weight loss drug. The Germans were experimenting with what later became, or what became at that time, amphetamines and methamphetamine, which became the bulwark of the Nazi onslaught. The Blitzkrieg was fueled by cocaine, but especially by methamphetamine. And there's a wonderful book about that. But anyway, ketamine came to life in and was dormant. It was put on the shelf. Then a wonderful psychochemist, in some ways the psychochemist, or within a spectrum of 3 or 4 people, including Albert Hoffman, who invented LSD and synthesized psilocybin. Um, Amongst that small group of people, Shulgin, who was a very close friend of mine, had worked for Dow Chemical and lived in Berkeley, and became psychedelic in his own way. And he began as a chemist to do substitutions on molecules, and there are really 2, maybe 3 essential molecular structures that are psychedelic that we rely on. One is called phenethylamine, of which there's a core structure. Within that framework, we have, with substitutions, a variety of related chemicals that are familiar to us. Mescaline is a phenethylamine. MDA, which was very popular in the 70s, is still around. 2CB, which is popular still now. MDMA, MMDA, a host, hundreds of chemicals. And Sasha began to create those. He created much of that chemical lore. The second group, just to be complete, is the tryptamines. And people know about DMT, which is the core active principle of ayahuasca, and people know about mushroom psilocybin, which is a tryptamine. 5-MeO DMT is in popular use. So those are, another kind of core nucleus with substitutions. So around 77, Sasha hit on MDMA, and he tasted everything personally, and then he would work it up. And he had a research group. I was in the tail end of that research group. So the process was he would carefully work up for toxicity and effect a new chemical personally. He kept diligent journals that are the source of a whole new company now related to him. He's no longer with us, called the Alexander Shulgin Research Institute, exploring chemicals that aren't patentable that he made that can be psychoactive. So anyway, comes across MDMA, works it up, and he says, aha, this is a beautiful substance. This really is heartful and warm, not particularly psychedelic in the sense of hallucinatory, but within the framework, it's often cast aside as not psychedelic. But it is psychedelic in a different way. If it's mind manifesting, which is what psychedelic means, then this is a molecule that is mind manifesting. It changes our minds, broadens our view, opens our heart to ourselves and others, opens our heart to be able to tolerate our suffering and examine our behavior. So he worked that up, and then he gave it to the research group, and his wife, I don't think he had been married to Anne Shulgin, who also just died recently. He had a wife who died of cancer before Anne. And then he gave it to a guy named Leo Zeff. There's a wonderful book called The Secret Chief about Leo Zeff. Leo Zeff was a military, he was an army psychologist, a little diminutive guy. And he had a group in Berkeley underground called The Family. And that was hundreds of people, doing underground work. Really not so underground at that point because most things were still legal. We didn't have the analog drug bill. We didn't have a variety of other things. So Leo started seeing what would happen in the family, and he got a lot of data. And when I came along in 1983, and I had a session with my then wife, Alice, with Sasha and Anne, it was a remarkable experience. Now, I was not naive. We were not naive to psychedelics, but this was a different kind of experience. It was warm, heartful, conversational, sensual, and not particularly sexual, though it can be sexual. Some people are sexual and some people are sensual, and it's always sensual, meaning it's warm, intimate, and evokes connection and intimacy. So everything was legal at that point. We formed an informal organization called ARUPA, the Association of Responsible Use of Psychedelic Agents. And we had sponsorship down at Esalen because one of the owners was very psychedelic. He died, unfortunately, in a terrible accident where we don't have to talk about it, but it was on the land. And our sponsorship ended. But for a period of time, we would go for a week or so, twice a year, free. And we had this amazing group of people, many of whom are still around, those who are of us who are alive. Rick Doblin was in that group, who's the founder of MAPS, and that's how we became close. Many famous people. The founders of Hefter were in that group. So the psychedelic organizations that came out of it, especially in the period when things were illegal, that was the formative. Uh, it was really like an ovary. It just things came to life from it, including myself. And so, in that framework, I was a pioneer in working with families and in doing couples work. And couples work was a lot of what we did. Why did we do couples work? Because it fosters the intimacy between people. And you could do conflict work, and you can send couples to their room and let them find each other. And it just fostered a sense of conflict, openness, conflict examination, love openness, love examination, basically reducing senses of differences to that have been exploited by relationship into senses of compatibility or not. And it tends to give a glow. So a lot of people in that period, I did hundreds of couples between 83 and when it was made illegal, 86. I was doing 2 or 3 couples a day, 6 hours. It was a lot of work. In the
Wow.
beginning, we actually took medicine with people because the feeling was, and some people still do this, so it consumes you if you're a practitioner. Um, the feeling was that one, which is essential to ketamine now, that if you give people a substance that you don't know about that's psychoactive, you're really not able to confer with them. You're really not able to bond. You don't know what they're going through. So, an essential point coming out of that period and applicable to the ketamine period is that if you're going to use a powerful psychedelic, and MDMA is one, and ketamine is extraordinarily powerful, that you, as a practitioner, should know it. So these programs you've been, you know, confecting for us online are programs in which people have that experience deliberately. Groups of 30 to 40 people have two kinds of experiences in the ways in which we as a group um, administer ketamine. But back then, that's what we were doing a little bit. But you burn out, so we didn't do that very long. We did couples. I still have some friends who were married during the glow of that period. But you had to caution people because they get so excited about each other ultimately, and they would
Yeah.
get married, or and then reality would dawn eventually, and you would have couples breaking up. So that wasn't bad. That was pretty good. And then along comes the DEA in 1986. Before the DEA, and this is an interesting point, and then I'll allow you to ask me a question to get yourself
I
in
mean,
here.
you're answering questions I have in my head before I ask them, so that's why I haven't interrupted you. Go.
Thank you. I
Yeah.
appreciate that. I'm trying. So in 1985, the DEA comes along. At that point, maybe there are 10,000 people using MDMA. There
Okay.
are the number of practitioners is small. Maybe there are 500 to 1,000 across the United States. Nothing bad is happening. Everything we know now about MDMA, we learned then, other than the neuroscience, which has progressed, but really not contributed at all to the use of MDMA. MDMA is use application in humans is the same now as then, with modifications due to FDA controls on the studies being done. But in any event, DEA comes along and decides to schedule MDMA, and they have a Schedule 1, which means you can't touch the stuff. LSD is in there, heroin's in there, most of the psychedelic molecules are in there now. And if one escapes, they have an analog drug bill, which came in the 1990s, that said if there's any analog, remember we talked about phenethylamines and tryptamines, these are
Yeah.
all analogs of those two core structures. If you have one of those related to those core structures, don't think you're getting away with it. It's going to be scheduled. If a case comes up, you lose. So, they covered themselves with that. Okay, so we actually win. Well, we go to court. We had an international, national kind of following on it. I testified on video. They appointed an administrative law judge of their own. And the administrative law judge did exhaustive hearings. He was a very honest guy. And within the DA classifications, he found that MDMA could be abused, but also had clinical utility, which would keep it out of Schedule 1,
Schedule 1,
keep
right.
it legal within probably Schedule 2, which is probably where the drug will go now once it passes FDA, which it looks like it will. So we could have kept it. But the DEA said, the hell with you, our judge. We're going to dismiss you, our judge, and we're going to schedule it as Schedule 1. The end of MDMA as a prescribable open thing. And I just want to make one more comment about it.
Yeah.
Because when we look at that period, people were very worried about making drugs legal. I'm very worried about keeping drugs illegal. Whole countries are destroyed. This whole immigration flux that we see from Latin America, the destruction of Honduras, Guatemala, Mexico in a large number of ways, country after country, because of our consumption. Remember, we're the consumers. We drive the market. So the stuff coming up, cocaine, etc., which is, creating the whole culture of gangs and dissolution and lack of civilization and misery in countries and criminality, is because of our own criminality. So if you go back to that period, there were no controls. There was nothing on cocaine. People were doing cocaine, for example. It was $100 a gram, and there was a driven money economy, which wasn't good. Cocaine, for instance, in that period of time in the 60s, 70s, was seen as a good thing. There was a fine book extolling its virtues called Snowblind. But if you took MDMA in that period, there was people doing it. People call it recreational. Sometimes it is. I call it explorational. People exploring the nature of the substance and doing it, and people using it clinically, like we were, at low cost. So one of the things that's happening, as an aside on this, coming out under FDA successfully for MDMA, is the cost of the drug itself and the cost of the program is prohibitive. It's the story is, and it's not defined, but it seems to be, that a 3-session MDMA experience under clinical circumstances will be $15,000 to $25,000. Well, there's no
Wow.
insurance, and if there is insurance, it's not going to cover that. And you have to sit with people for 6 or 8 hours. They have to decide. So you're going to do one a day. So the cost is going to be an extraordinary barrier to use. Okay. So what does that do? So if you take the legal period, you had kind of basically 3, 4 types of experiences. You had people buying the stuff and using it. It was available. Hard to get because people weren't making it, but there was an explosion in production, as you can imagine. It was really cheap. It could be $5, $10 in that period of time per dose, a real dose. Um, and and that was one kind of way in which it was used. It was used socially. Eventually went into the rave culture. That was actually in the illegal period, and people would use it to party and dance, so socially. And then people would do it underground, but it wasn't called underground because there was no reason to be underground. People would come up who were practitioners who felt they had the capacity to administer this to couples or individuals. And then there were the clinical people who were licensed and who thought or felt we knew what we were doing in terms of working with people in a way that was helpful, especially to depression, PTSD. We focused a lot on depression and relational aspects and spiritual aspects, couples, relational. Couples was big because it's so social. So there was no particular abuse. Okay, 1986 happens and the door is closed and 3 million people are using it by the end of the year.
Wow.
Now, you make something illegal, and this has been true throughout. You make something illegal, illicit. A few things happen. It raises the cost of the drug, right? So when you raise the cost of the drug, the production cost is pretty much the same. You raise the cost of the drug, you're really dealing with an economy being created, you know, like the marijuana economy, if you look at that and its failings and difficulties, or any of the economies of substances. You bring in people who are, under the radar, trying to be, who are manufacturing this stuff and making a lot of money on it.
Hmm.
And so the money driven aspect, the forbidden fruit aspect, um, and the wonderment of the substance. I mean, you're prohibiting a substance that, in the majority, nothing is perfect, is good for human beings. And when you do that, and people become aware this is good for human beings, A, they're either ignorant and they just want to try it, or B, they know it's good for human beings and they want to get into it, and they get into it.
Let me ask you about what administering it and what a session looked like. So you were doing two a day. Were they 3 hours long?
No, no, I was doing one a day. Sometimes two. I would make them. No, the minimum was 5 hours, 6 hours. It depended. You had different schemas for it. We still do. If you could go to someone's house, you could leave at a certain point. And it's an intimacy drug, so basically 5, 6 hours. So you
Okay.
could do two in a day, but that was a lot of work. That's 12 hours.
Yeah. Yeah. And what
Um,
is what does that look like? Is it similar to what ketamine is? Is there like an hour in and then an
no,
exploration? So what is the
remember,
actual five
ketamine's a
hours look
real peak. Okay, depending on dosage and how much you're giving, and
like? Uh-huh.
ketamine is a peak drug. So it hits a peak and then it declines rapidly, and it's mostly over an hour, 15 minutes. Then you have a tail, so it adapts well to a clinical situation. We do 3 hour sessions as psychotherapy. The IV people do nothing of that sort. They just pump you with a bit of ketamine, and you're done in 50 minutes, and then they send you home. And we could talk about that in terms of why we're not for that kind of work. But ketamine allows us to do at least two sessions a day because its spectrum, even within the intensive therapeutic realm, is allows us to have a period of 3 hours with recovery, etc., and then at home work. But uh, MDMA is much longer. And when we did an MDMA study in this home that you're in my home, for MAPS with people who had life-threatening illnesses, and that was FDA approved. And we had people sleeping overnight here as part of the FDA protocol. And you had a 12-hour, definitely 8-hour mandated period. And that may well be what comes down when the FDA schedules MDMA, hopefully soon, that the mandate will be for 8 hours. And that will mean, the expense that we talked about, because clinicians, there will be two of them, will have to remain uh, with the patient for 8 hours. But in the good old days, if you did someone at home, and this still happens, you could leave at an appropriate point. 3, 4, 5. 3 would be early in LA, which was much more expensive in your neighborhood. It was people often left at 3 to 4 hours. We didn't. We stayed 5 to 6 hours. But going back to the question of how you are on it, um,
Well, not just how you are, but what's the clinician's role? Are they
it
just an
depends on what.
observer? Are they talking?
No, you're interactive. So there are two streams, as I describe it in my talks. Here we are in psychedelic work. One stream emanated from LSD work and Stan Groff and those people, um, where you had very intensive uh, altered states that could be paranoid or not. And what they did, and we often do it, we do it with ketamine, is we will have people wear eye shades and listen to music. But those were very long experiences, and the interaction was just supportive. There was no psychotherapy really in those frameworks. There was follow up, but not really psychotherapy. And then, so that's one model. It's a
Yeah.
model in widespread use. In a way, the ayahuasca groups are like that as well.
I
So it's
think a
not
lot of psilocybin has that kind of effect, has that kind of
mushrooms.
practice.
Well,
Yeah.
let's talk mushrooms. We don't have psilocybin. People taking mushrooms. No one has psilocybin. That's research.
Yeah.
So mushroom work has also been that way. Though mushroom work lends itself more to interaction, but
Interesting.
MDMA and low dose ketamine, because ketamine has a spectrum of dose, leads to what's called psycholytic experiences. That was done with low dose LSD by Sidney Cohen, in which you have interaction. MDMA is an interactive substance, so you could have a session as we've had for 6 to 8 hours, someone talking the whole time,
Wow.
because MDMA is on a nucleus of methamphetamine. MDA is on a nucleus of amphetamine. So there's a stimulant property to it, which makes people alive,
Energetic. Yeah. Right.
breathe, jaw clench, various things, energetic. So, but you tend to have people go in and out, and the streams are of like dreams. They're trips, but they're not, vividly hallucinogenic like ketamine or LSD, etc. So it lends itself to psychotherapy. It's a brilliant substance for psychotherapy, as is ketamine when you use it in a way that allows for that. And you wrap methodologies around any substance which has its own particular, what we call a signature.
Got it. What was, when you were practicing it with couples, what was the typical aftermath like? Did they, because it's obviously, it sounds like it's a huge aid in helping bond and helping create that intimacy. How long before it kind of, that feeling tapers off? I mean, obviously if the couple's doing the work, then they can keep it up. But it's when did you find that reality sinks in? Did you have couples coming for yet another treatment because they wanted a boost?
Well, it's a great question, but it's a broad spectrum answer. So, some couples would realize that they don't belong together. And they would say, okay, we've checked this out. We really have checked ourselves out. We've looked, and even with MDMA, ain't no hope, baby. We just ain't going to make it, right? We're too different. It's too much. And that's a good thing. It saves a lot of time, right?
Oh
So
yeah.
that was one small part of it. Another part of it would be that you would end up with a glow and really happy. And how long that glow would last was indeterminable. It could be a lifetime. It could be 3 days. Um, and so, in terms of repetition, how often we do a couple session, if we were ending up in a couples process with a couple that was involved with us, I was doing a couple session, repeating it once a week. So we've gotten confused by the FDA strictures on how often to do it with MAPS. But MDMA tends not to be a substance that you can repeat within a day or two, because there is a loss of both, whether it's serotonergic, whatever it is, that's a whole other level of neuroscience. Um, it's not as strong. You can pump it, people pump it, try and do it more often. But once a week for depressed people or for people really wrangling with each other, or I'd have people come out and spend a month out here, and I'd see them, and they were, very in very great difficulty, divorcing, hating each other, and I would, they wanted a shot. Did we have it? We've been together 20 years. What do we got? And so we would do that, or the treatment of depression, which I would still do if with MDMA, and I would put the ketamine in. If I had ideally a psychotherapeutic regimen together, I would use those two substances. I'd put in marijuana within that framework because marijuana has its place. Uh, I'd like one other kind of psychedelic like mushrooms. That's why I think we see these out there now because they're ideal. I'd really like ayahuasca to be legal, uh, but again, these are experiential inputs. So if we just stick with the relational impact of these substances, we're talking MDMA, ketamine. There are other relational and pathogens. I don't like entheogens. I'm a non-theist, as some of us call ourselves, rather than an atheist or an
Right.
agnostic. I'm a non-theist. So I'm a secular Buddhist in my view. So I think uh,
I actually,
that's
while you're
how
on that non-theist, I had a question. The experience of psychedelics is so intense for people, especially if they haven't had it before. What is the role of the practitioner to not assign any kind of spiritual practice? Because I have a feeling you're incredibly vulnerable and susceptible to kind of ascribing or assigning some kind of a spiritual meaning to the experience. And does the clinician sometimes get into a compromised kind of position there?
I think that's a very good question. Um, there are two parts to it. One, people often feel, and why did it become known as an entheogen? So, religious people or people of a spiritual bent saw these substances as bringing them closer to God or the sense of the divine or metaphysical space or interplanetary or psycho physicalist where you see all matter embedded with spirit. um, People have a variety of experiences that, because of the awesomeness and the connection to awe, internally, there's a sense of I've seen something different. I have that, it's certainly been part of my life. Does that make me believe that there is a personal creator? No. So you're not left with, stupidity really. You're left with inquiry if you're going with it. And you tend to, reform. So, if you're a down home Catholic or a down home Jew and you do this, I just did a training in Israel, it either brings you into a sense because you're primed for it of the divine, or it makes you question your values and who you are and what you really believe in. So that's that. Then you go to the practitioner side, which was your question, and the practitioner should be neutral. In our clinic, which I have designed and love, there is a feeling of spirituality. There's certainly Buddhist iconography, which most people don't understand or relate to, and I don't try and push it. But there's a sense of candles and of Buddha there, and of flowers, and of softening, because I'm trying for the softening. I'm
Right.
not trying to, people have used LSD especially to create combativeness. So
Right.
these substances are not neutral. Can you make MDMA combative? Pretty hard. I haven't really seen it. Do people fight on MDMA? They argue sometimes, sure. Some of the common joke is, why do they call this ecstasy? Right? I'm not feeling ecstatic. I'm having trouble.
Right.
And you may have trouble, and psychedelics are not designed to not look. They open the doors to looking at what you're really about and how you behave towards people, and where you've messed up and who you are and who you've hurt, and who's been hurting you, and your illusions about things. MDMA is great on that. And when we did the study here, we were seeing people every 2 weeks with MDMA, with people who had life-threatening illnesses, and that was, sometimes three, but basically 2 weeks. That was better than a month apart.
Yeah.
So again, if I were using MDMA and ketamine as well, we do frequent sessions with ketamine. Um, my role is not to tell people what to think. my role is to help people come to knowing what they're about and to explore. And because ketamine and MDMA, but ketamine, we'll talk for a moment, opens you up, excuse me, to seeing your attachments and where you are. I'm really a depressed person. Well, I have a ketamine experience and I'm not depressed in it. Ketamine is
Right.
very positive on average. And I come back from that, I said, wow. And this is where we do influence people. We say, are you really a depressed person if you've had the experience of yourself as a not depressed person? Or is your essence, is your sense of self such that you believe you're a depressed person?
Is there
I
anyone?
think, I think we should be value neutral.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that there's, especially if you have someone who has a bias, that could be quite dangerous in the wrong
But there
circumstance.
are people who are practicing from a religious perspective, and
As
doing
long as
work.
it's transparent from the start, I think that could be okay.
Well, it's cultural. I mean, we have people in our International Ketamine Psychotherapy Associates. We just did a talk from Texas, rural Texas, and they have to conform to the the values of the area, well, not by promoting them, but by accepting them, or they don't
Yeah,
get papers.
that makes sense. What is there anyone practicing couples work with ketamine? Is it possible?
We do it all the time.
No kidding, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
And so there's enough interactivity possible on ketamine to have an effective session with a couple.
ketamine is a substance administered in various levels.
So a
we
lower dose,
we don't do microdosing with ketamine because that's a whole other issue.
right?
But we do low dosing, and we do it in groups. And their interactiveness, there might be a period where people are not very interactive, but that could be short, and then a sharing of that. We're doing a practice. We're doing a group in May called Dharma K, where we're exploring the effects of ketamine on practitioners ourselves. It's a non-hierarchical program. No one's ever done it. To look at, if you do ketamine in various ways, what's the effect on your uh, spiritual contemplative practice and your use of psychedelics? So that's going to be a lot of fun. Um, it's a very flexible molecule in terms of the depth of what it causes.
If someone's listening and they've never thought about psychedelics, and they're curious, what would be your kind of guidance to them? Is it something for curious minds? Is it something when nothing else has worked? Kind of where do you fall on the spectrum in terms of your guidance?
Exploration of consciousness, soul, and mind is a vocation, not an avocation. The legitimacy of exploring molecules that affect mind is, as legitimate as exploring meditation or religiosity or yoga or, travel. I didn't mention ketamine is a terrific substance when used for intimacy, and sexuality emerges out of that. And we're just starting to really teach people about that. Sexuality is, an exploration as well in a good way. So I think this is part of the availability of us looking at ourselves and growing. I mean, I would say in my life, and it's not true for everyone, some people have, hit the rocks on substances. And then we have addiction issues and we have overuse issues with psychedelics. So they're pretty safe on the average. Um, I would say that my whole life's been changed by that, but within a framework of general exploration of consciousness and relationship and activism, trying to be a whole person.
Thank you so much. I can't thank you enough for being here. If you want to look more into Phil's work, I'll put all the links in the show notes, but there's the ketamine research foundation.org. There's also the ketamine training center.com. He's doing incredible work. I am honored to be a part of it, just in whatever capacity I can be. And I think anyone listening can see why. You're just a vault of knowledge in this area, and one of my favorite people on the planet.
Thank you.
If you're interested in learning how to get the absolute most out of your romantic relationships, then you're in luck, because I have put together a free workshop or masterclass, if you will, about 3 secrets that people in happy relationships have discovered. You can view the workshop at mrspirituality.com/3secrets. Again, it's completely free. Just go there and watch it. It'll help you on your journey, give you some wisdom, some things to think about. The website again is mrspirituality.com/3secrets. That's mrspirituality.com/3, the word secrets. It's all yours. Enjoy.